My grandfather, he just passed away, but there was a secret that he left with everyone. It turns out that all his wealth, all his assets, all his businesses, and most importantly his money, was not left to our family like we thought it was. It was left to one very in particular person who I'm going to tell you about, and you simply will not believe your ears.
This is a story that is immensely embarrassing to admit on the internet, of all places, but I have no one in my life who can help me. So to start off, I will give you a bit of context. I'm an architect, and I do design luxury apartments and office spaces in major cities across the United States. I come from a very wealthy family. My father is the chairman of a luxury fashion brand, and my mother works as a consultant for national banks. So I've had a very privileged upbringing, but my house situation has never been one that is happy. I have 3 brothers who are all older than me, and at home there was always a fight. My brothers are very rebellious and fight all the time with my parents, which leads to more fights between my parents as well. I was considered the princess of the house because I've never said much to anyone. I tried my best to not cause more troubles at home. This was amplified by all the business and political fighting at home as well. My grandmother was the main reason for this. She stayed at home and watched TV all day. She used to stay over whenever my grandfather went off on world tours to some third world countries. My grandfather Rick was a very interesting character. You see, he started the fashion company that my dad works at. It dates back into the 80s, but after I was born, he completely gave up his luxury lifestyle and went backpacking. My grandmother, she followed him for a while when he went around the United States, but after he started leaving the country, she just stayed at home. My father tried to convince his dad that he needed to stop this and stay at home. Enjoying his retirement lifestyle, it was not interesting enough for him. My grandmother was a peculiar character, who purposely created tension at home between my mother and us. She was not happy with the way my brothers were allowed to argue and disobey them. This all changed, though, when we got a call from a stranger saying that my grandfather had passed away in Vietnam. At first, we thought this was definitely a joke. Someone had stolen his phone and called to extort some money. The person who called was insistent and even sent us a photo of my grandfather's corpse. Before this could become news, my father went to Vietnam in the company's private jet and flew my grandfather's corpse back. On the way back, it was already news since they had to report it to the authorities. My grandfather's funeral, it was a mixture of strangers. Half of them were people who knew him as a businessman, and other half were the friends that he made afterward. During the commotion, a dark-skinned lady from the crowd of black gowns and suits came to greet my grandmother. She introduced herself as Syeda. She was sniffing and crying her eyes out, and my grandmother, being an old-timer and an avid Fox News fan, was blatantly surprised that her white husband had a dark-skinned friend who was crying this hard at the funeral. She did not acknowledge the presence of her at all. Rather, I just ignored her and moved away. My mother, who felt sorry for the woman, started to talk to her. I just watched from the sidelines like I always did, not wanting to involve myself in the drama. My boyfriend, Brad, was with me. He was on the phone making calls to his office, and after that it felt like an hour. My mother walked away from the woman looking absolutely petrified. She walked up to me and asked me to go on a walk with her to the nearby coffee shop. Apparently, my grandmother had a headache, so she was going to get a coffee. While on our way there, my mom kept looking at me, hoping I would ask what was troubling her. But I decided long ago that getting involved in family matters only gets you into unnecessary trouble. So, eventually, she would burst out and started telling me in a very shocking accusation. The accusation was that the woman, Syeda, was my grandfather's mistress. So, she had spoken about Grandpa Rick's lawyer talking to her about a will. So Syeda came up to my grandmother to clarify. My mother was deathly scared of telling my father, since this would mean the company's majority stock and inheritance of various houses all over would be in the hands of a stranger. This would become a huge scandal, with my father and his two siblings even resorting to legal action to get their shares. She prayed that this strange lady was lying, so none of that would come to fruition. We went home to the funeral. My mom did not come with us, and she told my dad that she had met a friend, but I suspected that it would be the family lawyer, Mark. At home, my grandmother started telling us stories of Grandpa Rick and her. The way they met, and from the wedding to my father's birth, and eventually how her husband Rick abandoned her to find peace and life. My aunts, which were her daughters, tried to console her as much as possible, and Grandpa was already pushing 80 years of age. So my Aunt Helen had a lot of questions for my dad, who allowed him to roam around this way. A fight started again, though this time it was a quiet one, with just a few thought-out, piercingly insulting statements thrown at each other in between bouts of silence. The cousins and I went out for a smoke, not wanting to engage in a fight. All 7 of us were victims of such fighting adults all our lives. My boyfriend had gone back to work, and it had been a long time since all the cousins got together, so we made plans to go out the next day. A plan that did not succeed. My mother came back late into the evening, even though she behaved normally in front of everyone else. I could see in her eyes that the issue had grown. This idea of a stranger holding such power over the lives of a family frightened me, but the curiosity of my grandfather's desire to hand over such an important job to someone that none of us would know haunted me even more. My mom came into the room at night after all my cousins had left. She closed the room and added even more fear. Turns out Syeda, according to the lawyer, was introduced as a, quote, spiritual soulmate by my grandpa. The lawyer also told my mother that my grandpa told him that he wanted to teach his kids a lesson. Though she could not understand why the lawyer followed the guidance and completely formed the will, so Syeda gets complete authority over the distribution of Grandpa Rick's properties, and she will also have to establish a trust in his name. The trust will take 25% of Grandpa Rick's stock in the fashion company industry at the current evaluation and be, well, philanthropic in the nature. This was all up to Syeda to mitigate and convince the company. My aunts are quite rational and mature when it comes to addressing very serious issues, as far as I've ever seen. So I was confident that they would be able to take the news in some sort of normal way. The next day, the news was eventually broken by my father and my aunts. They all had different types of breakdowns. My dad was furious and stormed away, screaming that he would find the woman and sue her. My Aunt Rose, who stays in Milan, just started crying. She thought that at the end of her father's life, the only person she could trust turned out to be a stranger. She regretted staying away from him and verbally abused everyone for, in a sense, abandoning him. Aunt Helen went completely silent. Her eyes looked dead, and so, with the looming presence of a stranger basically deciding the fate of the family, all of us went to bed that night completely shattered. My mother, early into the morning, started convincing everyone of the strategy that she had in mind. It was to meet this Syeda person together as a family once before we went about trying to solve the issue on our own. If everyone could get what they wanted, then this legal battle seemed unnecessary. The first thing they did was contact the lawyer and request that he sets up a meeting for next week. The lawyer was apprehensive about the meeting since he saw the way all of us reacted to the news, and apparently even Syeda was shocked at this responsibility handed to her. Hence, he tried to postpone the meeting as much as he could. But my dad gave him a week deadline, which he reluctantly agreed to. It was going to take place at our home, and Syeda could bring her own friends and family to the meeting. A week later, on the day of the fateful meeting, my mother, she gets a call from Syeda. who asked if she could bring her kid to the meeting since she could not find a babysitter. Well, my mother agreed and called me to help her with maintaining the meeting. No one would shout at me. I've always maintained a healthy relationship with them that way, and my aunts and their husbands were present as well, all engaged in making some call or another. Syeda arrived with a lawyer, and behind her hiding place was a 4-year-old boy who was introduced as Rahim. Everyone was told about a small kid arriving with her, but the kid also started asking a lot of questions about my grandmother. The idea that the kid could be Grandpa Rick's, well, it hung up there in the air. The conversation between the adults started out civil. My father put on his businessman charm and tried to weave the conversations around what Sieda's goals were with grandfather's inheritance. My aunts just watched on. This was not their fight. They would readily negotiate with my dad to get what they wanted, and Sieda's response, however, shocked everyone. She was completely clueless. She literally had no idea that Grandpa's inheritance would even be handed over to her this way to distribute, and this surprised absolutely everyone. But my grandmother spoke for the first time, and I asked her the question everybody wanted to answer. Syeda then told the story of how she met Grandpa Rick and got close to him over the years. They've met around 20 years ago when she was barely 20 years of age. She was an immigrant in the country, working 2 part-time jobs and trying to sustain a living. Her parents worked regular jobs that barely sustained their lives. Grandpa Rick, he was already traveling around the States by then, trying to walk away from the constant stress of business. This is when he met her. He had given a talk to her at a community college, and they kept in touch afterward through a lot of email correspondence. And a year later, Sieda's father passed away tragically in an accident. Grandpa Rick promised to take care of her education and future if she was willing to work hard for him. This she did, and she was now working as a psychiatrist and translator for the U.S. government. She was heavily involved in drafting bills and amendments that affected immigrants entering the country. But she was a shy person who apparently asked Grandpa Rick about his family a lot, though he never gave her a full, clear answer. He just kept making the joke that someday she would meet us and regret it. This did not garner any laughter, but she smiled. At the end of the story, the lawyer said that my grandmother had given up her authority over Grandpa's inheritance by signing it off before his death. My grandmother nodded and was bombarded with questions from absolutely everyone. Turns out, during his business days, my grandpa had asked her how she would leave this and all behind. And my grandmother, being old-fashioned, told him that she did not want the headache of partitioning the company and wealth. So she legally signed off on it, thinking her husband would be fair and square in the ordeal. This caused an absolute uproar. My father, my aunts, and their husbands were all shouting and commenting on their inability of my grandmother and the entire family. This caused insults and accusations to be hurled at each other as well, like wildfire. The fight became uncontrollable, and the party just got into smaller groups to argue and fight over. Syeda tried her best to mediate the whole thing, completely giving up, and watched in shock just like me. Eventually, the fight turned towards her, and she just sat and listened to the insults without replying for a solid minute. I then had to push the people away and tell her, the lawyer, to escort Syeda back home since it looked like a family would not reach a conclusion any time soon. After she left, we cooled everyone off from the fighting, and it took nearly an hour of continuous effort from my mother and me. After this, everyone left in some form of anger to go back to their lives and try to figure out a solution to the problem. So, Syeda said before leaving that since Grandpa Rick's last wish was this, she would try her best to distribute it as equally as possible. I told her I would meet her alone because I had a lot of questions of my own. I went off to meet my boyfriend Brad after that. Since he works in the Defense Department, he told me that he would try to find out about Syeda. I trusted her story, at least most of it, but I felt like even she was hiding something. Well, Brad heard the whole story and felt like there was something missing in all of it as well. We went our different ways. Now, with all this story, I just felt lost. Everyone I thought to be a sensible human in my family is turning weapons against each other, trying to get most out of the situation as they can. And yes, we're supposed to be a dignified family. I still don't understand why my grandpa would do such a thing. I'm hoping to meet Syeda again next week. We'll see if this can solve any of my questions. Update number 1. So, it's been 2 weeks since I've updated here because after I met Syeda last week, there was a lot of work I had to finish before I could update, and unfortunately the problem has grown. First off, last week before I met Syeda, I got a call from my boyfriend Brad telling me some interesting news. It turns out most of the story Syeda told was true, but she left out very important details. After graduating college, she traveled with my grandpa for nearly 7 years before joining the current job that she's working at. Also, they traveled and behaved like a couple during these trips. This meant she's not as innocent as she pretended to be, and this also means my grandpa is not as altruistic as we thought him to be in his later years. Though he could figure out the kid was born on U.S. soil, the father's name is not registered. But Brad said he suspected the father was Rick. This was all a little too much for me, so I called my brother Jack. He was in college doing his master's at Harvard. Even though he can be quite aggressive like my father, he was too far away from the drama to do anything about it. I wanted to know how to tell our father and aunts about the news that Grandpa had an affair with someone less than half his age. He suggested that I confront Syeda, figure out whether she was willing to cooperate with the family, and then spring the news on her as a threat. If she did not budge, then I should tell Dad about it so his lawyer could use it in the lawsuit that he would inevitably file. With this in mind, I called Syeda to meet at a Perch restaurant for lunch, and she agreed, and we met there 2 days later. She started off by saying some apologies for causing a ruckus at home and not leaving early without even trying to figure things out. I assured her that her actions were for the best since it took them a while to calm down, and her staying would have just increased that. So, then I asked her about the kid and to tell me more about her and Grandpa's relationship. She was quite glad to talk about her kid Raheem, but sort of chuckled out while trying to define her bond with Grandpa. When I pressed more, she just gave a very dry reply that Grandpa was a guide to her life and nothing more. So I quickly changed the topic to the will and how she planned to make sure all of it worked out. She then told me that the lawyer had given her enough information about how much my father and aunts were worth individually. She would be distributing the wealth in terms of stocks and property based on net worth rather than making it equal. This would definitely irk my father, since he has worked and earned a lot more than his siblings have. She also said that since the stocks of the company will be in her name for the time being, she'll take a loan out until the next fiscal year to start the trust fund that was mentioned in the will. After which, she would sell the stock to the investors and finish the loan. She just hoped that in a year all of these shenanigans would be over, and if the family wanted, they could keep in touch with her. This was a sweet gesture, but I had to show my cards now. So I told her that after some research on her background, we knew she was leaving out a lot of the story. She becomes quite serious and responds with only a strict cold sentence. She agreed that they had an affair and that she was with him when he passed away, but she denied the child being his. Apparently, they had a very open relationship, and you see, Grandpa Rick wanted to have it that way, so there was absolutely no way that they would ever think of having children. She described their relationship as one of the common interest. Grandpa Rick, after retiring from the business side of things, wanted to help and make the world around him a better place. So did she. Both of them had lofty ambitions to start schools and hospitals to help the poor and needy. So the affair was purely a physical manifestation of that, and this was too creepy for me on many levels to even accept it. So I just nodded throughout the story while thinking of ways to explain what I heard to my mother and father. After the meeting, I called my mom and told her everything I've searched for the past week. It turns out that she has also done some digging of her own and found out from Grandpa's assistants about both of them. So we both agreed to break the news to my father, and that evening, when we did not tell him, he just sat there shocked for the first time since Grandpa's funeral. He was so sad that the last people his father loved were not even his blood. So he promised to get vengeance on the person who had taken, quote, advantage of Grandpa during his, quote, weak mental state. The next week, my mother spent time with my dad's newly hired law firm, while my dad worked all night trying to convince the investors that he would be their best chance to make sure the company ran smoothly. So that's where it stands now. Max by the end of the month before the official meeting where Syeda would propose the way that she would distribute the inheritance. My father and his siblings would be filing a lawsuit against her on the basis that Grandpa was not in the right mental state and physical state to make changes to his will. Guys, I'll let you know what happens in the very next update. Update number 2. Hey guys, I want to give you a final update, and I do understand that it's been over 2 months since I've last updated. But life has been quite hectic, and every time I sat down to write it, there was more happening. But all in all, the story's concluded, positive or negative, I will leave it up to you to decide. After my father and aunts filed the lawsuit, Syeda called in to ask if there was seriously a route my family wanted to take. I tried my best not to be rude, and told her that the lawsuit was in motion and any defense or threat she had needed to be addressed in the court of law. She laughed at me and cut the call, and during the first hearing, Syeda admitted to the affair and justified it by saying that she was told by my late grandfather not to disclose it to anyone. After this, her side argued that my grandfather, until his death, was in a very stable mindset. During the next hearing, witnesses from both sides were brought forward. On our side, it was a former assistant and business partners who confessed that Grandpa Rick had, during his last year in the company, completely lost interest in life. This was backed up by a couple of psychiatrists who even went for therapy to manage his stress and depression. This was very solid evidence to support the idea that my grandpa was probably sick. His former assistant even showed how many payments that he made to random accounts. Our side was hinting that these payments were because he was having a lot of affairs and involving himself in tons of nefarious activities and just needed the money. I hated this portrayal of Grandpa, but I did not know him during those final years, so hey, I guess it could have been true. But tarnishing a man's legacy after his death, so you can distribute his wealth, seemed a bit too off-putting to me. But we were happy that the momentum was on our side. Though, we were happy it only lasted a while because Sieda's side produced absolute strangers who Grandpa had met during his travels around the world. The strangers told very fascinating stories of how Grandpa had helped them out or lived and enjoyed life with them for months together. His assistant was also cross-examined, and he admitted that many of the dubious payments he confessed about were to such people, yes. The stories also showed that Grandpa was in a very stable state of mind and was willing to take on any challenge. They even pointed out how Grandpa did not even drink during his stay with them. He had told them that alcohol has been his drug to sustain that pressure of life, and now that he did not have any, he was not interested in drinking. The jury was confused, but after more hearings and a lot of back and forth, it became clear to them that the same way it was for us. Grandpa had been unhappy with his days in business and hoped to become free of the corporate world. He saw it as a cesspool of all the worst sins of humanity, but getting out meant on some level abandoning his family. This is just a sacrifice he made to at least nourish the last portion of his life. The jury ruled in favor of Syeda, who just looked relieved that all this was over. So, after the judgment, my father and aunt met her once a week to negotiate the terms of the settlement. Apparently, according to my mother, at least there was no more shouting. They tried their best to be as civil as possible regarding the whole partition. They all even agreed to contribute a yearly sum to the trust fund as well, and after the final decisions were made, Syeda handed over letters to my father, aunt, and grandmother. The letters were written at different points in time by Grandpa Rick to his children. Though he never let me read it, I could see whatever he read affected my father a lot. Well, but to everyone's surprise, I got a letter too. I did. I was the only grandchild to get one, and Syeda came all the way to give it to me at my office. She said it was the last letter Grandpa ever wrote. The last one was for Syeda herself, and I read it, though I don't feel comfortable sharing all the contents of the letter here. I will say this much. It was advice regarding how I should lead my life. I was the only one who had not seen Grandpa as a businessman, but rather as a very cool person. Though I do not forgive him for cheating on Grandma and sort of completely distancing us from his life. I don't know. I can understand from his side why it was so necessary. His death and his life have left behind a complicated mess of emotions in our family, though I'll be in touch with Syeda and the others who only know him as a happy-go-lucky stranger who help them. I don't think my family will be. I guess the last question I will leave you guys with is this. Do you think that he was a good man?
So this story was very interesting. I'll start with the comment section because it had a lot of different opinions. A lot of people were saying the family is the one to blame, not Rick's behavior or the fact that he was cheating or the fact that he had a mistress. No, they were saying the family is the one who abandoned him, did not give him the opportunities and just the love that he needed, so he went somewhere else to find the opportunities. But there were also quite a few commenters who were saying, Rick, he abandoned his family, he left them, and then he gives all the assets to some stranger. And I also want to know what you guys think about the kid. Do you think it was really Rick's baby? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comment section. This story had so much drama to unpack, so let's talk about it. If you guys are new to the channel, my name's Mr. Reddito. I narrate stories every single day. We have stories that are drama-related, inheritance disputes, absolute affair partners, Karens in the wild, you name it, we cover it. And I even started a new channel called Mr. Reddito's Revenge, where all the stories are based on revenge stories. You can find that link down below in the description for more daily videos as well. I hope you guys have an amazing day. I'll see you tomorrow, and remember, it's cool to be kind. See ya!